In 1917, Tolkien started writing the very first pieces of his epic legendarium, and he would not stop until his death in 1973. During this time, the world he created underwent thousands of changes, as Tolkien was something of a perfectionist who never seemed to be completely satisfied with his work. Many of these changes are minor, inconsequential, or from a time when the legendarium was almost unrecognizable, but some are far more interesting. One in particular. One abandoned concept where, if even for a brief moment in time, Tolkien's vision of Numenor was far different to the one we have today. This is a video about steampunk Numenor. In 1936, Tolkien began to greatly expand upon his legendarium. At this point, he had already written many of the stories of the First Age, although they were mostly very different to the versions we have today. You can find many of these tales in the first 5 books of the History of Middle-earth series. He had also written an earlier version of The Hobbit, although it was an entirely self-contained work that had nothing to do with the greater legendarium at this point. But Tolkien was now introducing a new concept to his work, Numenor, inspired by the legend of Atlantis. You can find these original writings in the 5th volume of the History of Middle-earth, The Lost Road and Other Writings. It makes for an interesting read because it's a blend of a lot of Tolkien's earlier writings as well as a lot of his later writings. It feels like the Akallabeth, The Downfall of Numenor, but it's written in an entirely different way. For example, characters like Elendil, Sauron and Ar-Pharazôn exist and play largely similar roles. The story deals with Sauron coming to Numenor and corrupting it and the king, much like it plays out in the actual Akallabeth. However, there are some major differences too. The story is told from the perspective of Elendil, who is telling it to his young son, Herendil. Anarion and Isildur do not exist yet. Elendil's father is named Valandil and does not appear, and the role of Amandil is taken up by Elendil's friend, Arontor. Fun fact, Arontor has a daughter named Firiel, and it's rumoured that Firiel will instead become Elendil's daughter in the Amazon show. Elves are never called elves, and are instead referred to as firstborn Erisians or gnomes. And finally, Sauron is not brought to Numenor as a prisoner, but comes willingly after the king summons him. Tolkien never finished the story, but he did leave notes that speak of 2 different conclusions, and trust me, they're a lot darker than the actual Akallabeth. Yes, I know, how can something be darker than the literal destruction of an entire island full of millions of people? But trust me, it is. But our focus is on Sauron, and as I said earlier, Sauron plays the same role in the draft story, corrupting Numenor into a dark, evil empire. But unlike in the actual Akallabeth, Sauron doesn't just corrupt Numenor, he industrializes it. And behold, what hath happened since step by step. At first he revealed only secrets of craft, and taught the making of many things powerful and wonderful, and they seemed good. Our ships go now without the wind, and many are made of metal that sheareth hidden rocks, and they sink not in calm or storm, but they are no longer fair to look upon. Our towers grow ever stronger and climb ever higher, but beauty they leave behind upon earth. We who have no foes are embattled with impregnable fortresses, and mostly on the west. Our arms are multiplied as if for an age-long war, and men are ceasing to give love or care to the making of other things for use or delight. But our shields are impenetrable, our swords cannot be withstood, our darts are like thunder and pass over leagues unerring. Where are our enemies? We have begun to slay one another. For Numenor now seems narrow, that was so large. Men covet, therefore, the lands that other families have long possessed. They fret, as in men in chains. There's a couple of very interesting lines in that paragraph. First, Sauron teaches the Númenóreans how to build ships that are made of metal and sail without wind. To me, that sounds like ironclads or dreadnoughts that are fired by either coal or steam engines. There's also towers growing stronger and climbing higher, but not being beautiful to behold. This one is much more open to interpretation, but I think it can definitely be interpreted as Sauron teaching Númenóreans how to build pre-modern skyscrapers of sorts. And finally, our darts are like thunder and pass over leagues unerring. Darts that sound like thunder and can travel for miles can really only be interpreted as a form of artillery, or at the very least, gunpowder weapons such as cannons, bombards, or mortars. From this paragraph alone, we see that Tolkien once had a very different vision of Numenor. Compared to other men, the Númenóreans were technologically advanced, but these advancements are relatively mundane compared to advancements in our own world. Things like hollow steel bows, ships that could easily traverse the ocean, enchanted weapons, unbreakable stone, and rotating towers is quite a big deal in Middle-earth. But gunpowder weapons, skyscrapers, and metal ships with engines? Those are so different that it doesn't even feel like Middle-earth. This isn't the only reference to Númenóreans having technology that would fit into a steampunk setting. In the 9th volume of History of Middle-earth, at the end of the Third Age, there are more. This was from a third version of Númenor's fall, which is much more similar to the final version that we're familiar with, and the exact date of its writing is unknown, although Christopher states that it was definitely written before 1942. In this version, there are two very clear references to Númenóreans having flying ships. But ever the number of those that had the ancient site dwindled, and those that had it not and could not conceive it in their thought scorned the builders of towers and trusted to ships that sailed upon the water. And the second reference, but they achieved only ships that would sail in the air of breath, and these ships flying came also to the lands of the New World and to the east of the Old World, and they reported that the world was round. Therefore many abandoned the gods and put them out of their legends. But men of Middle-earth looked up with fear and wonder, seeing the Númenóreans that descended out of the sky, and they took these mariners of the air to be gods, and some of the Númenóreans were content that this should be so. Now, a flying ship does actually appear in Tolkien's work. That would be Eärendil's ship, Vingalote, and Vingalote was a normal ship with sails that just so happened to magically fly. So it's entirely possible that the flying ships of the Númenóreans were exactly that, ships with sails that could fly. However, it's also possible that these flying ships were actually airships of either the Zeppelin sort or the steampunk/fantasy sorts that appear in IPs like Warcraft or Guild Wars. There's no definitive proof for this, but one must remember that assuming Tolkien wrote this in the late 30s, which seems likely, it was during a time when airships weren't a complete meme. And given that Tolkien had already written the Númenóreans as possessing what appears to be metal ships, gunpowder weapons, and possibly skyscrapers, then airships would fit in as well. But as cool as it is to talk about, it's ultimately all irrelevant. In 1948, Tolkien wrote yet another version of the downfall of Númenor, and although he would continue to make minor changes until the late 50s, this is the version that appears in the Silmarillion. Metal ships, flying ships, giant towers, and gunpowder weapons are all absent, leaving us pretty certain that he abandoned the concept of a steampunk Númenor. In the 60s, he continued to expand upon Númenor, and once again, the aforementioned concepts were notably absent. As far as we know, Tolkien never gave a reason as to why he dropped steampunk Númenor, but a good reason isn't hard to find. When Tolkien first wrote about Númenor, it was an independent story, and the connecting of the different parts of the Legendarium only started happening afterwards. Once connected, the earlier versions of the downfall of Númenor would feel out of place. It would become harder to reconcile Númenor and Sauron's technological advances with the rest of the Legendarium. For example, if Sauron was capable of creating such technological advancement, why wasn't Mordor or Angband similarly advanced? To fix this, there would only really be two solutions. Either rewrite the rest of the Legendarium so that steampunk technologies don't stick out, or simply rewrite Númenor. It's no surprise that Tolkien chose the latter, and as cool as a dystopian steampunk Númenor might have been, I think the world is better without it. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. To anyone who hasn't read them, the History of Middle-earth volumes are full of incredibly insightful information, and you can find all sorts of interesting things. But I will warn you, the books are a slog, Christopher loved to talk, and some of the stories are kinda really weird. Thanks again, cheers, and remember, if the Titanic was a wooden ship, it would have had time to avoid the iceberg.